My name is Sarah Mitchell, I'm 32 years old, and I swore I'd never set foot in Millfield, Georgia again. I'd spent the last 15 years running from everything this small town represented, the suffocating traditions, the judgmental whispers. And most of all, my grandmother's iron grip disguised as godly love. But when Grandma Evelyn's lawyer called saying I'd inherited the old family estate with one strange condition, I had no choice but to return. The condition? I had to live in the house for 6 months and discover the truth about what really happened to Pastor Smith. Pastor Smith. Even his name made my stomach twist. He'd been our family's spiritual mentor until he mysteriously vanished. During a spiritual retreat in 1998, when I was just 7 years old. Everyone said he'd probably had a heart attack hiking alone in the woods, though his body was never found. As I pulled up to Grandma's Victorian house on Magnolia Street, memories flooded back. The endless church services, the strict rules, the way Grandma controlled every aspect of our family's life through fear disguised as faith. I'd rebelled as a teenager, dated the wrong boys, skipped church, got tattoos, and she'd made it clear I was no longer welcome in her perfect Christian world. The house looked exactly the same. White paint peeling slightly, wraparound porch. With hanging ferns, and that imposing presence that had always made me feel small. I grabbed my suitcase and headed inside, the familiar scent of lavender and old wood greeting me like an unwelcome embrace. In the living room, everything was preserved. Like a museum. Grandma's Bible study books, her collection of inspirational figurines, and dozens of framed photos of church events and family gatherings. Notably, very few included me after age 16. But something was different. On the mantel sat a manila envelope with my name written in Grandma's careful cursive. Inside, I found a handwritten note and an old brass key. Sarah, my stubborn granddaughter. If you're reading this, then the Lord has finally brought you home. Pastor Smith didn't disappear. On that retreat, he was murdered, and I've spent 25 years protecting our family from the truth. But secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. The key opens his old office in the church basement. Find what he hid, expose the lies, and maybe you'll understand why I was so hard on everyone I loved. Some battles require armor, even if it makes you look cold. Grandma Evelyn, I stared at the note, my hands shaking. Murder? Grandma protecting secrets? This was not the woman who'd raised me with strict biblical principles and unwavering moral standards, but as I looked around the house with new eyes, I began to notice things I'd missed as a child. The way family photos had been carefully arranged to exclude certain people. The locked drawer in her desk I'd never been allowed to open. The phone calls she'd taken hushed tones, always ending with, "We agreed to never speak of this again." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Pastor Smith, his kind smile, the way he'd sneak me extra cookies during church potlucks, how he'd been the only adult who'd ever defended me when I asked too many questions during Sunday school. If someone had killed him, they'd destroyed the one person in that church who'd made me feel accepted. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to that basement office, whatever I might find there. The next day, I drove to Millfield Community Church, the white steeple piercing the morning sky like an accusing finger. The building looked smaller than I remembered, but the parking lot was still full for Wednesday morning prayer meeting. I recognized several cars. This town never changed. I circled to the back entrance, hoping to avoid the congregation. The basement door was exactly where I remembered, hidden behind overgrown azalea bushes. The brass key fit perfectly, and the door opened with a creak that seemed to echo my racing heartbeat. The basement was darker than I expected, filled with old Sunday school supplies and broken pews. But Grandma's note had mentioned Pastor Smith's office, and I found it behind a partition wall, a small room I'd never known existed. The key opened this door too, revealing a space frozen in time. Pastor Smith's desk still held his coffee mug, now stained with 25 years of dust. His sermon notes lay scattered across the surface, and his personal Bible sat open to Jeremiah 1 verse 12, "I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled." But it was the filing cabinet that made my breath catch. It was packed with documents, newspaper clippings, and photographs that painted a picture I'd never imagined. Financial records showing massive discrepancies in the church's building fund. Photos of church leaders meeting with known gamblers from Atlanta. Bank statements revealing money being funneled to offshore accounts. And at the bottom of the deepest drawer, a manila folder labeled "Insurance Fraud Evidence." Inside were copies of life insurance policies, fake medical reports, and a list of names that made my blood run cold. At the top, Evelyn Mitchell, coordinator. My grandmother, but the most damning piece was a handwritten letter from Pastor Smith, dated 3 days before his disappearance. I can't continue to stay silent. The building committee has been stealing from God's house for over 2 years, and now they're talking about more desperate measures. Evelyn thinks she's protecting the church's reputation, but covering up sin only makes it grow stronger. If something happens to me, look in the old Hartwell well behind the church. They think I don't know about their meetings there, but God sees everything. The truth must come to light. Pastor James Smith. My hands were trembling as I read. The Hartwell well, I remembered it from childhood, an old stone structure from the 1800s that the church had always kept covered for safety. If Pastor Smith suspected something, I stuffed the most important documents into my purse and headed outside. The old well sat about 100 yards behind the church, covered by a heavy wooden lid that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The weeds around the base had been disturbed recently, and there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Someone else had been here. I tried to lift the wooden cover, but it was too heavy. I needed help, but who could I trust in a town where my own grandmother had apparently been involved in covering up a murder? That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Sarah Mitchell. I wondered when you'd show up. I turned to see Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, the church treasurer for as long as I could remember. She was a thin woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had always seemed to see straight through to your sins. Mrs. Hayes, I said, trying to sound casual. I know exactly what you're doing, she interrupted, stepping closer. Your grandmother called me before she died. Told me you might come looking for answers about Pastor Smith. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Do you know what happened to him? She studied my face for a long moment, then glanced back toward the church. Walk with me, child. There are things you need to understand, but not here where others might listen. Mrs. Hayes led me to her car, an old Buick that had probably been new when I was in elementary school. We drove in silence to the outskirts of town, finally stopping at a small diner that had seen better decades. Inside, she ordered coffee for both of us and waited until the waitress was out of earshot before speaking. Your grandmother wasn't the woman you thought she was, she began. But she also wasn't the woman the rest of this town thought she was either. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Evelyn discovered the building committee was embezzling money in early 1998. The church had raised over $200,000 for a new sanctuary, but the money was being siphoned off by Thomas Hartwell, Bill Crawford, and Jake Morrison. They were using it to cover gambling debts and bad investments. The names hit me like a physical blow. Thomas Hartwell was the mayor's father, a man everyone respected. Bill Crawford had been my Sunday school teacher. And Jake Morrison was my own uncle, my grandmother's brother. When Evelyn confronted them, Mrs. Hayes continued, they convinced her that exposing the truth would destroy the church. 3 families would be ruined, their children would suffer, and the congregation would lose faith. They promised to pay it back quietly. But they didn't, I said. No. They couldn't. Jake had lost even more money trying to win back what he'd stolen. So they hatched a desperate plan, fake Jake's death in a car accident and collect his life insurance to replace the church money. I felt sick. And Pastor Smith found out? James was too good a man to be fooled by fake medical reports and staged accidents. He'd been a paramedic before becoming a pastor, and he knew Jake's heart attack symptoms were manufactured. When he started asking questions, they panicked. Mrs. Hayes pulled out a small recorder and set it on the table between us. Your grandmother gave me this before she died. She said if anything happened to her before you came home, I should make sure you heard it. She pressed play, and my grandmother's voice filled the small diner. Sarah, I know you'll hate me when you learn the truth, but I need you to understand. When they killed James, I wasn't protecting the church, I was protecting you. Jake threatened to hurt you and your mother if I didn't help them cover it up. I spent 25 years gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose them without putting my family at risk. I became the cold, controlling woman you remember because I thought if I could make you strong enough, hard enough, you could survive the truth when it finally came out. I never meant to drive you away. I meant to prepare you for this fight. Tears were streaming down my face, but I forced myself to keep listening. The evidence is all in James's office. They think they killed him and buried their secret, but James was smarter than they gave him credit for. He recorded their confession the night before they murdered him, and he hid the recording where only someone who truly knew him would think to look. Check his Bible, Sarah. Jeremiah 1 verse 12 was his favorite verse about God's justice. The recording is there, along with copies of everything. Make them pay for what they did to that good man, and maybe you can forgive an old woman who loved you. The only way she knew how. The recording ended, and Mrs. Hayes reached across the table to squeeze my hand. She never stopped loving you, Sarah. She just stopped knowing how to show it without putting you in danger. I wiped my eyes, feeling a strange mixture of grief and determination. Are they all still alive? The men who killed him. Thomas Hartwell died 5 years ago, but his son Michael knows everything. He helped dispose of the body. Bill Crawford moved to Florida, but he comes back every year for the church anniversary. And Jake? She paused. Jake never left town. He's been living under the name Jacob Morrison, running a small business, pretending to be a distant cousin who moved here after the real Jake died. My uncle faked his own death and has been living here under a fake identity for 25 years. And getting away with murder, she said grimly. But not if we can help it. We drove back to the church in Mrs. Hayes's Buick, both of us lost in thought. The parking lot was nearly empty now, prayer meeting had ended, and most folks had gone home for lunch. Back in Pastor Smith's hidden office, I approached his Bible with trembling hands. Jeremiah 1 verse 12, I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The pages fell open naturally to that verse, as if they'd been opened there countless times, and there it was, a small digital recorder. No bigger than a matchbook, taped to the inside back cover of the Bible. Mrs. Hayes and I looked at each other, both afraid of what we might hear. But we'd come too far to stop now. I pressed play, static filled the room, then voices became clear. Pastor Smith's voice, nervous but determined, it's March 15, 1998. I'm recording this meeting because I believe my life may be in danger. Then other voices, ones I recognized even after all these years, Bill Crawford, James, you need to understand the position you're putting us in. Jake Morrison, my uncle, very much alive, we've worked too hard to let one man's conscience destroy everything. Thomas Hartwell, the money will be replaced. No one gets hurt. Pastor Smith, 3 families have already been hurt. Thomas. The Williamses lost their home because you stole the money they donated for their daughter's medical bills. The Johnsons can't afford to send their son to college because their building fund contribution is sitting in Jake's gambling account. Jake's voice, cold and threatening, you're going to keep your mouth shut, James, or you're going to have an accident. A very permanent accident. You're talking about murder, Pastor Smith said, his voice steady despite the fear we could all hear. Bill Crawford, we're talking about survival. And not just ours, yours too, if you're smart. Thomas Hartwell. Think about it, Pastor. A tragic hiking accident. Happens all the time. But it doesn't have to happen if you just forget what you think you know. Pastor Smith, I know what I know, Thomas. And God knows it too. I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. Jeremiah 1 verse 12. The truth will come out, one way or another. Jake's voice again, then let's make sure it comes out the way we want it to. The recording ended with the sound of chairs scraping and footsteps leaving. Pastor Smith's voice came back, quiet and sad, if anyone finds this, know that I tried to do the right thing. The evidence of their crimes is in the filing cabinet. The money trail leads back to accounts they think I don't know about. And if something happens to me, look for my body in the old Hartwell well. Jake thinks I don't know they meet there to plan their schemes, but I've seen them. God help me, I should have acted sooner. Mrs. Hayes and I sat in stunned silence. We had everything, confession, evidence, and even the location of Pastor Smith's body. We need to call the police, I said. We need to be careful, Mrs. Hayes replied. Michael Hartwell is the police chief now. And Bill Crawford's nephew is the district attorney. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. These families had spent 25 years building their power in this town, making sure they controlled the very institutions that should have brought them to justice. Then we do what Grandma would have done, I said. We make them confess in front of the whole congregation. But as we were gathering the evidence, I heard footsteps in the basement above us. Heavy boots, moving deliberately toward the hidden Office. Someone's coming, I whispered. Mrs. Hayes grabbed the most important documents while I pocketed the recorder. We needed another way out, but the office only had one door. The footsteps stopped right outside. A man's voice, muffled but familiar. I know you're in there, Sarah. Your grandmother's dead, but her meddling isn't buried with her. It was Jake, my uncle, who was supposed to be dead. And he didn't sound like he was here to chat about family memories. There's another way out, Mrs. Hayes whispered, pointing to a small window near the ceiling. It leads to the old coal chute. I could hear Jake trying keys in the lock, cursing under his breath. We had maybe 30 seconds before he got inside. Mrs. Hayes boosted me up to the window, and I squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping my arms on the rough concrete. I reached back to help her, but she shook her head. I'm too old and too slow, she said. Take the evidence and go. Get to the church sanctuary, it's Sunday evening service in 2 hours. Make them confess in front of everyone. I'm not leaving. You have to. This is what your grandmother prepared you for. The door burst open just as I dropped down on the other side of the foundation. Through the small window, I could see Jake Morrison, older, grayer, but unmistakably the uncle I remembered from childhood. Where is she, Dorothy? He demanded. Where's who? Mrs. Hayes replied with the kind of steel I'd never heard in her voice before. Don't play games with me. Sarah's here, and I know she's found Smith's little treasure trove. James Smith was a good man, Mrs. Hayes said. Better than you ever deserved to serve under. James Smith was a self-righteous fool who couldn't understand that sometimes good people have to make hard choices. I wanted to stay and help her, but I could hear more footsteps upstairs. Jake hadn't come alone. I clutched the recorder and documents to my chest and ran toward the main church building. The sanctuary was empty and dimly lit, late afternoon sun streaming through stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns on the wooden pews. This had been my childhood church, where I'd sat every Sunday listening to sermons about truth and justice, never knowing that the pillars of the community were built on lies and murder. I needed a plan. Evening service started at 6 o'clock. And it was already past 4. The congregation would arrive soon, including the remaining conspirators. This was my chance to expose everything, but I had to survive long enough to do it. I made my way to the sound booth at the back of the sanctuary. If I could get control of the microphone system, I could broadcast the recording to everyone at once. But first, I needed to make sure the evidence would survive even if I didn't. I used the church's copy machine to duplicate the most important documents, then hid copies in different locations around the building. I uploaded the audio recording to my phone and sent copies to my email account and to a friend in Atlanta. If something happened to me, at least the truth would survive. By 5:30, cars were pulling into the parking lot. I recognized many of them, families I'd grown up with, people who'd known me since I was born. They were about to learn that their community had been built on a foundation of murder and lies. I slipped into the sound booth and tested the microphone system. Everything was working. Now I just had to wait for the right moment. The sanctuary filled up quickly. I spotted Bill Crawford in the third row. He'd driven up from Florida for the anniversary service, just as Mrs. Hayes had predicted. Michael Hartwell sat near the front with his family, wearing his police chief uniform as if it were a badge of honor instead of a costume, and there, walking down the center aisle like he owned the place, was Jake Morrison. He was scanning the crowd, looking for me. Our eyes met across the sanctuary, and his face twisted into a cold smile that he knew I was trapped. The current pastor, a young man named David Chen, took the pulpit and welcomed everyone to the 25th anniversary service. He began with a prayer for Pastor Smith, who gave his life in service to this church. That's when I knew it was timed out. I switched on the microphone and stepped out of the sound booth. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice echoing through the sanctuary. Before we pray for Pastor James Smith, I think you should know how he really died. The congregation turned to stare at me, some with confusion, others with recognition. I saw my mother in the crowd, her face pale with shock. She'd come for the anniversary service not knowing I was even in town. My name is Sarah Mitchell, I continued, walking down the center aisle toward the pulpit. Some of you remember me as Evelyn Mitchell's rebellious granddaughter. What you don't know is that my grandmother spent the last 25 years of her life gathering evidence to solve a murder that this community has covered up for far too long. Sarah, stop. Jake Morrison stood up, his voice carrying the authority he'd never lost despite being legally dead. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about, Uncle Jake. Or should I call you Jacob Morrison? Is that what it says on your fake ID?" Gasps rippled through the congregation. Several people turned to stare at Jake, recognition dawning on their faces. "Pastor Smith didn't disappear on a spiritual retreat," I announced. "He was murdered by 3 men who had been embezzling money from this church. And one of those men has been sitting in these pews for 25 years, pretending to be someone else." Bill Crawford tried to stand and leave, but I'd locked the sanctuary doors before the service began. Michael Hartwell was reaching for his radio, probably calling for backup. "I have the recording," I said, holding up my phone. "Pastor Smith recorded their confession the night before they killed him. Would you like to hear it?" "Don't you dare." Jake snarled, starting toward me, but I was already pressing play. The voices filled the sanctuary through the sound system, clear, unmistakable, damning. As the congregation listened to their respected community leaders planning murder, the atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to horror to rage. These people had donated their money in good faith, trusted their leaders, built their lives around a church that had been corrupted from within. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. "That's not all," I continued. "I have bank records showing where the money went. I have insurance documents proving Jake Morrison faked his own death. And I have evidence that Pastor Smith's body is in the old Hartwell well behind this church, where it's been for 25 years. Michael Hartwell stood up, his hand on his gun. "You need to stop talking, Sarah. Right now. Are you threatening me in front of 200 witnesses, Chief Hartwell? Just like your father threatened Pastor Smith? My father was a good man who made one mistake. Your father was a murderer who raised a son to cover up his crimes." The congregation was on their feet now, voices raised in anger and confusion. Some were calling for Michael to arrest the conspirators. Others were demanding to know who else had been involved in the cover-up. In the chaos, Jake Morrison lunged toward me, but he was 73 years old and not as quick as he used to be. 3 men from the congregation tackled him before he could reach me. "Call the state police," someone shouted. "We can't trust our own." Bill Crawford was crying, his face buried in his hands. "I never wanted James to die," he sobbed. "It was supposed to be just the money. Just a loan until we could pay it back." "But you helped dump his body," I said. "You helped my grandmother live with 25 years of guilt and fear." "Your grandmother chose to protect us," Michael Hartwell said, still defiant. "She could have turned us in at any time. She was protecting her family from you. She was protecting me." I looked out at the congregation, at faces I'd known since childhood. My grandmother became the coldest, most controlling woman in this town because she was terrified that if she showed any weakness, these men would hurt the people she loved. She drove me away to keep me safe, and she died without ever knowing if I'd forgive her. The sound of sirens filled the air, state police, called by someone with a cell phone. But the real justice was happening right here, in front of the community that had been betrayed. 6 months later, I stood in the same cemetery where my grandmother was buried, but this time I wasn't alone. Pastor David Chen was with me, along with Mrs. Hayes and several other church members who had become my unlikely family. The trials were over. Jake Morrison had been sentenced to life in prison for murder and fraud. Michael Hartwell got 20 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Bill Crawford, who had testified against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence, would spend his remaining years in prison knowing that his cooperation had finally brought justice for Pastor Smith. The old Hartwell well had indeed contained Pastor Smith's remains, along with the murder weapon, a tire iron. That still had Jake's fingerprints on it after all these years. The truth had literally been buried beneath this town, but it had finally come to light. The church had voted to establish the James Smith Memorial Fund, using money recovered from the conspirators' assets to help families in crisis, the kind of fund Pastor Smith had always dreamed of creating. Mrs. Hayes had been elected to the church board, and she was determined to implement financial transparency measures that would prevent future corruption. As for me, I decided to stay in Millfield. Not because I'd found religion again, that was still a work in progress, but because I'd found something more important. I'd found the truth about my grandmother, and in doing so, I'd found a way to forgive both her and myself. "She knew you'd come back," Mrs. Hayes said, placing a bouquet of magnolias on Grandma Evelyn's grave. She always said you had too strong a sense of justice to let sleeping dogs lie. I smiled, thinking about the irony. I'd spent 15 years running from my grandmother's rigid moral standards, only to discover that her greatest act of love had been protecting me from the very corruption those standards were meant to combat. Do you think she would have approved? I asked. The way I handled everything? Child, you stood up in front of the whole town and spoke truth to power. You risked your life to expose corruption and bring justice to a murdered man. That's exactly the kind of courage she was trying to teach you. I knelt down and placed my own flowers on the grave, wildflowers, not the perfect roses Grandma would have chosen, but flowers that grew freely and couldn't be controlled or contained. I forgive you, Grandma, I whispered. And I understand now why you had to be so strong. You were fighting a battle none of us could see. As we walked back toward our cars, Pastor Chen fell into step beside me. Have you given any more thought to my offer? He asked that he'd been trying to convince me to take over the church's community outreach program, a job that would involve helping people navigate crises, connecting them with resources, and advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. I'm not sure I'm the right person, I said. I'm still figuring out my own relationship with faith. Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person, he replied. You know what it's like to feel lost. You understand that sometimes good people make bad choices when they're scared or desperate. And you've proven that you're willing to fight for justice even when it costs you something. I looked back at the cemetery, at the town that had raised me and wounded me and ultimately shaped me into someone strong enough to fight for what's right. Okay, I said. But I'm doing this my way. No committees full of people who think they know better. No covering up problems to protect the church's reputation. And if I find any corruption, I'm exposing it immediately. Pastor Chen grinned. I wouldn't expect anything less from Evelyn Mitchell's granddaughter. As I drove through downtown Millfield toward my new life, I passed the old church where it all began. They'd installed a memorial plaque for Pastor Smith in the front garden, and I could see fresh flowers placed there by congregation members who remembered his kindness. The truth had been worth fighting for, even when it hurt. Justice had been worth pursuing, even when it seemed impossible. And forgiveness, for my grandmother, for myself, and even for a town that had lost its way, had been worth the hard work of healing. I wasn't the same rebellious girl who'd fled this place 15 years ago. I wasn't the bitter woman who'd returned 6 months ago, either. I was someone new, someone who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is preparing the people you care about to fight battles you can't fight for them, and I was finally ready to honor that legacy.